Along the banks of the Nile in the middle of Egypt is certainly one of the last places you'd expect to find a tribe of Hungarians, but around 400 years ago was the birth of a new group of people back in the former Ottoman Empire, a people that are still around to this day. But first, let's go ahead and discuss a brief history of the Hungarians, the Nile, and just how this Uralic people group ended up so far from home. Even aside from the well-known eras of Roman and Greek civilizations, the regions of Europe and the greater Middle East have had an extensive amount of contact and cultural exchange over the millennia, even during the Islamic period. It would probably surprise many to learn just how many small pockets in European or Middle Eastern society are deeply connected with each other. Although the country of Hungary today is very well integrated into Europe, being a part of the European Union and Schengen area for a little over a decade now, they too are in a way unique as a people group in the European continent. Many different people groups have contributed to the genome and culture of modern Hungarians, which, as most people know, speaking language that is not a part of any major European language family or even the wider Indo-European group, instead being a part of the Uralic languages, a trait shared by a few other European peoples today, such as the Finns, Sami, and Estonians, all around the Baltic Sea. However, they have a very different origin from the Hungarians, who lie isolated deep in the heartland of the continent, considered by some to be either in Central or Eastern Europe. As most people could probably imagine, the region of Hungary today has been very dynamic in the past, and before it was known as such, it was called Pannonia, and parts of the modern-day country lied within the Roman Empire as the province of Pannonia, with the original peoples most likely speaking various Celtic languages up until their subsequent Romanization during the Roman period. Lying on the fringes of the empire, the Pannonians were subject to frequent raids by Germanic tribes to the north, and of course later on by the famous Huns, whom early historians mistakenly associated with modern Hungarians, which is the etymological origin for the English name of the country. After the swift rise and fall of the Huns, the region was taken over by the Pannonian Avars, who were most likely an Altaic group from the steppes of Eurasia, and are not to be confused with the Caucasian Avars from the North Caucasus mountain region in Russia, who have a completely different origin and are actually still around to this day. During this time period, a minority of people in the Avar Khaganate spoke the Avar language, while the majority spoke an indeterminate Slavic language or Latin as a result of Slavic migration and the Roman period respectively. The language of the modern Magyars, known in English as Hungarian, is actually rooted in an entirely different migration of peoples who, interestingly enough, also come from around the same region, an area in the modern country of Russia around the Ural mountain region, hence where the name of the language family Uralic gets its origin. Most Uralic peoples of Siberia today have a rather Eurasian appearance, somewhat intermediate of Eastern Europeans and East Asians, and this was most likely the case of the original Magyar peoples who migrated across the Urals into Europe, following conflict with the Bulgars and other Turkic peoples in the region. The Magyars settled around the region of Pannonia around the 10th century AD, and although their numbers were relatively small at first, they managed to establish a kingdom in the region, gradually assimilating the people that already lived there. As most people might have noticed, the Hungarian people today don't look very Asian, and this is due to the high rate of intermixing with other Central Europeans, and thus, although Hungarians speak a Uralic language, genetically speaking they have far more in common with the surrounding Slavic or Romanian or Germanic peoples. Therefore, even though the modern people of Hungary are overwhelmingly European in appearance, they were still considered to be nomads or outsiders by many in Europe in the past, and indeed the region does have an extensive history of conquests and migration from outside sources. Two other groups that have contributed to modern Hungarian society are the Romani and Jassic peoples, with the Romani having roots in the Indian subcontinent and the Jassics having roots in the Caucasus mountain region. The Romani came to Hungary around 500 to 600 years ago and are a nomadic people group with a very fascinating origin. And although I have made a video on the Romani people in the past, I feel like it was too negatively biased, focusing too much on the negative aspects of Romani culture such as crime and poverty, and I'll be sure to make a follow-up video soon. The Jassics are related to the Ossetians, an Iranian people group in the northern Caucasus who migrated to Jassag in Hungary around 800 years ago after being chased out of the region by the Mongols and their Turkic allies. Now, how on earth did these Hungarians end up in North Africa? Well, it begins with the Ottoman invasions and conquests in the Balkans starting in the 1400s. A large proportion of the Hungarian kingdom in Central Europe was taken by the Ottomans during the Ottoman-Hungarian Wars, either being incorporated directly into the empire or as a vassal state, such as the Principality of Upper Hungary, which was technically a sovereign country but heavily dependent on the Ottomans, having to pay an annual tribute in gold. The Ottomans were known to have a very diverse army made up of mercenaries, slaves, and trained soldiers from all around its vast empire, and the Balkans was one of the regions where the Ottomans relied upon the most for sheer manpower. Through various coastal raids, the Ottomans would capture Slavs, Greeks, and other Balkan people, and many still from these conquered territories would be conscripted or volunteer as mercenaries for the empire, further adding to their numbers. Interestingly, this practice was also found in Egypt during the medieval age, with conscripted slaves from Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Caucasus serving as soldiers and as armed guards, eventually forming their own social class known as the mamluks, and actually establishing their own dynasty in Egypt for a couple of centuries until they were conquered by the Ottomans. So ironically, it's possible that soldiers conscripted from the Balkans and Anatolia by both the Ottomans and Egyptians could have fought against each other. Hungary was the farthest the Ottomans ever got in their conquests in Europe, and relatively few ethnic Hungarians were conscripted into the Ottoman forces when compared to other native peoples of the Balkans, but indeed a handful of Hungarian regiments were deployed by the Turks throughout the empire, eventually coming upon North Africa in 1517, which was in the process of being seized by the Ottomans as well. Now, I've talked about Egypt many times in the past, and the stance taken by Egyptians and other Arabic-speaking peoples always seems to be very divided. The people of Egypt have had a very ancient history with millennia of empires, cultures, and languages distinct from that of the Arabian Peninsula, and hence many Egyptians maintain an identity separate from others in the Arab world, although the majority of the population speaks Arabic as a result of the Arab conquest of the 8th century. The ethnic Hungarian troops in the Ottoman Empire's army that were brought to Egypt in the 16th century didn't really fit in well with other Janissaries, seeing how most were either Catholic or Protestant, as opposed to Eastern Orthodox, and were non-Slavic, and thus were segregated from other Ottoman forces. After the Mamluks were defeated by the Ottomans, many of the ethnic Hungarians that were veterans of the conquest were allowed to settle in the region, and seeing how the troops were entirely male, most of them converted to Islam and married the native Egyptian Arabs or Nubians, who, by the way, are unrelated to Arabs or other Afro-Asiatic peoples, instead belonging to the Nilo-Saharan family, and are much darker in appearance than the surrounding people. The resulting people group were known as the Magyarab, a fusion of Hungarian, Nubian, Egyptian, and possibly some Slavic influences as well. And it's unknown as to exactly when the community lost the Hungarian language in favor of Egyptian Arabic, but by the time they were discovered by Europeans in the 1930s, about 400 years later, no remaining members of the Magyarab tribe still spoke Hungarian, although a few Hungarian loanwords are still found in their dialect of Arabic, and fascinatingly, they still acknowledge their Hungarian heritage and consider themselves very distinct from their Nubian and Arab neighbors in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. Estimates vary on just how many Magyarab people there are today, ranging from around 10,000 to maybe even 60,000 at the very highest, and they were previously concentrated along the Nile near the Egyptian-Sudanese border, with village names including Magyar Nuriki, Magyarardi, and Magyaria. Although following the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s, many of their villages were flooded and they were relocated north of Aswan, with many still heading to Cairo, Alexandria, and some even traveled to Hungary. From what I've seen from the handful of Magyarab from Egypt and Sudan that have studied in or moved to Hungary since the 1980s, they haven't had much of an issue being accepted by the general Hungarian population. Another small wave have migrated from Sudan and Egypt in recent times to the United States, mostly integrating with other Islamic Middle Eastern communities. So let's get this straight. A tribe of Eurasian nomads from the Ural Mountains, who most likely have partial origins in China, migrates into Central Europe, and a group of this established Central European people then migrate to the Ottoman Empire and proceed onto the Nile River area. And even still, in the modern era, many of these people migrate even further, either back to Central Europe or across the globe to an entirely different continent. Just let that sink in for a minute. There are similar examples of people from the Balkans settling in the Middle East and North Africa during the Ottoman era, and the opposite actually, with there also being pockets of Africans and Middle Easterners also located in former Ottoman territory. But the Magyarab people really spoke to me when I first learned about them, because not only did my ancestors migrate from another part of the world, but I'm also part European, Middle Eastern, and African. Interestingly, despite practicing Islam, living in North Africa, and speaking Arabic for dozens of generations, the Magyarabs still consider themselves to be ethnically Hungarian and have been acknowledged as such by the World Federation of Hungarians since 1992. Please let me know your thoughts on the Hungarians, Ottomans, Egyptians, and the product of all three of these, that being the Magyarab, who have been described by many as Africa's lost Hungarian tribe, which is certainly something you don't hear about every day. As always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.